What if the real reason you keep losing isn't because you're lazy, weak, or undisciplined, but because you've been trying to control something that was never meant to be controlled? Think about your day. You wake up with good intentions. You tell yourself this time will be different. You'll stay focused. You'll avoid distractions. You'll finally become the version of yourself you keep imagining. But then your mind starts moving. Thoughts appear out of nowhere. Doubt creeps in. Urges pull you away. And before you even realize it, you're off track again. And in that moment, you blame yourself. You tell yourself you need more discipline, more control, more willpower. You think something is wrong with you. But what if that belief is the very thing holding you back? Because here's the truth most people never hear. Your mind is not designed to obey you. It is not a machine waiting for your commands. It is a survival system. It scans for danger. It seeks comfort. It repeats what feels familiar. It does not care about your goals. It cares about keeping you safe, even if that safety is the reason you stay stuck. So when you try to force your mind into focus, into motivation, into positivity, you create friction. You create resistance, and the harder you push, the stronger that resistance becomes. That's why you feel exhausted. Not because you're failing, but because you're fighting a battle that cannot be won through force. You've probably experienced this without even realizing it. The moment you try not to think about something, it becomes louder. The moment you force yourself to feel motivated, it disappears. The moment you demand control, your mind pushes back. This isn't weakness. This is how your brain works. And once you understand this, everything begins to shift. Because the problem is not that you can't control your mind. The problem is that you think you're supposed to. You've been playing the wrong game from the start. Imagine how much energy you've wasted trying to control every thought, every feeling, every impulse. Imagine how many times you've judged yourself for something that was never under your control in the first place. Now imagine what happens when you stop fighting that. When you stop trying to dominate your mind and instead start understanding it. When you realize that the goal is not control but direction, not force but influence, that's where real power begins. And if you stay with this, if you truly understand what's coming next, you'll unlock something most people never do. You'll stop feeling like a prisoner of your own thoughts. You'll stop relying on motivation that fades. You'll stop blaming yourself for patterns you were never taught to break. Instead, you'll learn how to work with your mind, how to guide it, how to shape it over time without fighting it in every moment. This is the shift that changes everything, not control, but mastery through understanding. And once you see it clearly, you'll realize you were never losing because you weren't strong enough. You were losing because no one ever showed you how the game actually works. And once you see that the game itself has been misunderstood, something inside you begins to settle. The pressure starts to fade, because now you're no longer trying to force control over something chaotic. You're beginning to see the deeper pattern behind it all. Your mind does not respond to pressure. It responds to repetition. That means every thought you keep having, every reaction you repeat, every habit you fall into is not random. It is trained. It is practiced. It is reinforced over time, quietly, without you even noticing. You don't wake up and decide to overthink. You don't consciously choose to procrastinate. You don't sit there and plan to doubt yourself. These patterns are already wired into your system. They run automatically, like a script that has been rehearsed thousands of times. And when the moment comes when you need to focus, to act, to move forward, that script plays. That's why it feels like you have no control. Because by the time you notice what's happening, the pattern has already taken over. You're not reacting in real time. You're repeating what your brain has learned. So when you try to fight it in that moment, when you try to force yourself to think differently or act differently, you're going against something that has already been activated. And that's why it feels so hard. That's why it drains you. That's why it rarely works. But this is where everything changes if you're willing to see it clearly. If your mind runs on patterns, then your life is not controlled by your thoughts in the moment. It is controlled by what you've practiced over time. Let that sink in. Your results are not coming from willpower. They are coming from repetition. This is why motivation fades so quickly, because motivation is emotional. It comes and goes. It spikes and crashes. But patterns stay. Patterns operate even when you feel nothing. And right now, whether you realize it or not, you are living inside patterns that were built unconsciously. The way you respond to stress, the way you handle discomfort, the way you deal with boredom, fear, uncertainty, it's all learned behavior. But here's the part that most people overlook. If these patterns were learned, they can be changed. Not instantly, not through force, but through consistent, intentional repetition. This is where your power actually exists. Not in controlling every thought that appears, but in choosing what you repeat daily. In shaping the small actions that slowly rewire how your mind operates. Because every time you repeat something, your brain strengthens that pathway. Every time you act in a certain way, you make it easier to do it again. And over time, what once felt difficult becomes automatic. That's how your current habits were formed, and that's exactly how new ones are built. So instead of asking yourself, why can't I control my mind? Ask a better question. What am I training my mind to do? Because whether you are aware of it or not, you are always training it. Every distraction you give into, every excuse you accept, every time you avoid discomfort, you are reinforcing a pattern. And every time you take a small step forward, even when it feels hard, even when you don't feel ready, you are creating a new one. This is not about perfection. This is about direction. Because once you understand that your mind follows what you repeat, you stop trying to win battles in the moment, and you start building systems that win for you over time. And that's where real change begins. And once you accept that your life is shaped by what you repeat, a deeper realization begins to form. Change does not happen in the middle of chaos. It happens in a moment so small, so subtle that most people never even notice it. Right before the reaction, right before you reach for your phone without thinking. Right before your mind drifts into overthinking, right before you tell yourself, I'll do it later. There is a tiny gap, a fraction of a second. And inside that gap is your real power. Most people live their entire lives without ever seeing it. They believe their reactions are instant, automatic, uncontrollable, but they're not. They are fast, yes. Conditioned, yes. But not unstoppable. There is always a signal before the pattern begins. A feeling, a trigger, a shift in attention. And if you can learn to catch that moment, even once, even for a second, something changes. You step out of autopilot. You create distance between you and the pattern. And in that distance, you gain choice. Not control over your thoughts, but control over your response. This is where awareness becomes your greatest weapon. Not the kind of awareness that judges or criticizes, but the kind that observes. The kind that watches your thoughts without getting pulled into them. The kind that notices the urge without immediately acting on it. At first, this feels uncomfortable. Your mind will resist it. It will try to drag you back into the familiar. It will tell you that this pause is pointless, that nothing is changing, that you might as well give in. But that voice is not truth. It is just the old pattern trying to survive. Because patterns do not disappear easily. They fight to stay alive. They want to keep running because that's what they've always done. But every time you pause, every time you notice instead of react, you interrupt that cycle. You weaken its grip. You begin to take back control, not by force, but by awareness. And then something powerful happens. You start making different choices. Maybe it's small at first. You delay the distraction for a few seconds. You take one step instead of avoiding it completely. You sit with discomfort just a little longer than before. It doesn't feel like much. It doesn't feel like transformation, but it is. Because in that moment, you are no longer acting out of habit. You are acting with intention. And intention, repeated over time, reshapes everything. This is how you begin to rewire your mind. Not by trying to control every thought, but by catching the moment before those thoughts turn into action. By creating space where there used to be none. The more you practice this, the clearer that moment becomes. What was once invisible starts to stand out. What once felt automatic starts to slow down. And slowly your reactions begin to change. Not perfectly, not instantly, but consistently. You stop being someone who is controlled by every impulse. You become someone who sees the impulse and chooses anyway. That is real strength. Because the goal was never to silence your mind. The goal was to stop letting it decide everything for you. And that begins in a moment most people never even realize exists. And as you begin to see that moment, as you start creating space between the urge and the action, another truth becomes impossible to ignore. You are not just shaped by what happens inside your mind. You are shaped by everything around you. Every detail, every object, every sound, every routine. Your environment is constantly influencing your behavior, quietly, consistently, without asking for your permission. And most of the time, you don't even realize it's happening. You think your struggle is internal. You think the problem is your mindset, your discipline, your lack of control. But look closer. The real force guiding your actions is often external. If distraction is always within reach, your mind will take it. If comfort is always available, your mind will choose it. Not because you are weak, but because your brain is designed to conserve energy. It will always follow the easiest path. That's not a flaw, that's efficiency. But if the easiest path leads you away from your goals, then no amount of willpower will fix it long term. You will keep fighting the same battles over and over again until you are drained, frustrated, and ready to quit. This is why relying on discipline alone is a losing strategy. Because discipline has limits. It fades under pressure, it weakens when you're tired, it disappears when emotions rise, but your environment does not get tired, it does not lose focus. It is always there, shaping your choices, guiding your behavior, reinforcing your patterns. So instead of asking yourself to be stronger, ask a better question. What is my environment training me to do? Look at your space. Look at your daily routine. Look at what is easy and what is difficult, because whatever is easy you will do more of. And whatever is difficult you will avoid. This is where real change becomes practical. You don't need to control your mind in every moment. You need to design a life where the right actions happen with less resistance, move distractions out of reach, create spaces that encourage focus, build routines that remove unnecessary decisions. Make it easier to start than to delay, because when the right action is the easiest action, your mind stops fighting. And when the wrong action requires effort, your mind begins to resist it. This is how you shift behavior without constant struggle, not through force but through design. You are no longer relying on motivation to show up. You are creating conditions that make showing up natural. You are no longer depending on willpower to stay focused. You are removing the things that pull you away, and slowly something changes. Consistency starts to appear not because you are pushing harder, but because you are flowing with a system that supports you. This is the difference between fighting your mind and guiding it. Because when your environment is aligned with your goals, your mind does not have to work against itself. It begins to follow. Not perfectly, not instantly, but steadily. And that steady movement forward is what most people never reach. Because they spend their entire lives trying to control what they should have designed. And as your environment begins to support you instead of sabotage you, something deeper starts to reveal itself. You notice that even when the path is clear, even when the distractions are reduced, there is still a quiet force pulling you back. Not from the outside, but from within. It's subtle. Almost invisible, but it's always there, the way you see yourself. Because no matter how strong your system is, no matter how well you design your environment, your identity will always set the ceiling for your behavior. You will act in alignment with who you believe you are, even if that belief is limiting you. If deep down you see yourself as inconsistent, you will find ways to prove it. If you believe you lack discipline, your actions will reflect that belief. Not because you want to fail, but because your mind is wired to stay consistent with your self-image. It protects that identity even when it's holding you back. That's why change can feel so uncomfortable. Not just because it's difficult, but because it challenges the story you've been telling yourself for years. A story built from past failures, from moments where you didn't follow through. From times when you lost control, gave up, or fell back into old habits. And without realizing it, those moments became evidence. Evidence that shaped your identity. Evidence that your mind keeps replaying, reinforcing the belief that this is just who you are. But that belief is not fixed. It is constructed. And anything that is constructed can be rebuilt. Not through words, not through empty affirmations, but through action. Small, consistent, undeniable action. Because every time you do something that goes against your old identity, you create a crack in that belief. Every time you follow through, even in the smallest way, you send a new signal to your brain. This is who I am now. At first it feels fake, it feels forced. Your mind will resist it. It will remind you of your past. It will try to pull you back into the familiar version of yourself. But that resistance is a sign that something is changing. Because identity does not shift in one moment. It shifts through evidence, through repetition, through proving to yourself again and again that you are capable of something different. You don't become disciplined by thinking like a disciplined person. You become disciplined by acting like one, even when it feels unnatural. You don't become consistent by waiting to feel ready. You become consistent by showing up when you don't feel like it. And slowly, something powerful begins to happen. The gap between who you were and who you are becoming starts to close. The actions that once felt difficult begin to feel normal. The resistance that once felt overwhelming begins to fade, and the identity that once held you back begins to evolve. Not because you forced it, but because you earned it, because you proved it. This is where real transformation takes root. Not in controlling your mind, not in chasing motivation, but in becoming someone who no longer needs those things to act. Someone who moves forward not because it feels easy, but because it is who they are. And once that identity starts to shift, everything else begins to follow. And as that identity begins to shift, as you slowly become someone who acts instead of hesitates, another truth rises to the surface. One that most people never confront honestly. You have been obeying your emotions, not just listening to them, but following them as if they were commands. Every time you feel tired, you stop. Every time you feel doubt, you hesitate. Every time you feel fear, you pull back. And without realizing it, your entire life starts to move in the direction of whatever you feel in the moment. But emotions are unstable. They change constantly. They rise and fall without warning, and if your actions depend on them, your progress will always be inconsistent. This is why you start strong and then fade. This is why you feel motivated one day and lost the next. This is why you wait for the right mood that rarely comes when you need it most. Because you've been taught to trust your feelings more than your decisions, but feelings are not designed to guide long-term success. They are designed to react to the present moment. They are signals, not instructions, and the moment you start treating them as signals instead of orders, something inside you shifts. You begin to separate what you feel from what you do. You can feel tired and still take a step forward. You can feel anxious and still continue. You can feel unmotivated and still act with intention. This is where real strength is built. Not in controlling your emotions, not in trying to eliminate them, but in refusing to let them dictate your behavior. Because the truth is, if you only act when you feel good, you will spend most of your life waiting. Waiting for energy, waiting for confidence, waiting for clarity, and while you wait, nothing moves. But action does not require perfect emotion. It requires decision. A decision to move forward even when your mind is filled with resistance. A decision to take the next step even when it feels uncomfortable. A decision to show up not because you feel ready, but because you refuse to stay where you are. And here's what most people don't realize. Action changes emotion, not the other way around. When you start moving, even in a small way, your state begins to shift. Energy follows movement. Confidence follows action. Clarity follows engagement, but you have to go first. You have to act before you feel ready. That is the break in the pattern. That is the moment where you stop being controlled by temporary states and start building something permanent. Because every time you act despite how you feel, you send a powerful message to your mind. I am in charge of my actions, and over time that message becomes your reality. You stop waiting for the perfect moment. You stop negotiating with your emotions. You stop giving them the power to decide your direction. Instead, you move, not perfectly, not effortlessly, but consistently. And that consistency begins to create something deeper than motivation. It creates discipline that is no longer fragile. It creates momentum that does not depend on mood. It creates a version of you that does not break under emotional pressure because it has learned to act in spite of it. And once you reach that point, you realize something powerful. You don't need to feel right to move forward. You just need to decide. And when you begin to move through decisions instead of emotions, when you stop waiting and start acting, you expect something dramatic to happen. You expect a sudden shift. A clear sign, a moment where everything feels different. But that moment rarely comes the way you imagine, because real progress is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand attention. It builds slowly beneath the surface, in ways you cannot immediately see. And this is where most people lose their momentum, not because they are failing, but because they cannot recognize that they are actually improving. You take a small step forward and it feels insignificant. You repeat an action and it feels like nothing has changed. You show up again and your mind tells you it's not enough. So you start to doubt the process. You question whether it's working. You wonder if you're wasting your time. And that doubt begins to pull you back toward old patterns, because at least those patterns feel familiar. At least they give you immediate feedback, even if that feedback is negative. But what you don't see is what's happening underneath. Every time you act with intention, your brain is adjusting. Every time you repeat a better choice, neural pathways are strengthening. Every time you resist an old habit, even slightly, you are weakening its hold. This is not visible in a single moment. It is not measurable in a day, but it is real. And if you stop too soon, if you give up because you don't see instant results, you interrupt the very process that was beginning to change you. This is the quiet trap that keeps most people stuck. They don't fail because they are incapable. They fail because they expect transformation to feel obvious, fast, and rewarding from the start. But real transformation is delayed. It asks for consistency before it gives you proof. It demands repetition before it reveals results. It tests your patience before it rewards your effort. And that is where your growth is decided. Not in moments of intensity, but in moments of doubt. When nothing feels different, but you continue anyway. When progress feels invisible, but you keep showing up. When your mind tells you it's pointless, but you choose to trust the process instead of your temporary perception. This is where you separate yourself from who you used to be. Because the old version of you needed immediate results to stay committed. The old version of you depended on visible progress to feel motivated. But the version you are becoming understands something deeper. That consistency creates results, even when those results are not immediately visible. That small actions, repeated over time, lead to changes that feel sudden but are actually built slowly. And if you stay with it long enough, something powerful begins to happen. What once felt difficult starts to feel normal. What once required effort starts to feel automatic. What once felt impossible starts to feel expected. Not because you forced your mind to change, but because you patiently trained it through repetition. And in that moment, you realize that the progress you were looking for was happening all along. You just had to stay long enough to see it. And when you finally see that progress was happening all along, something inside you clicks into place. The frustration begins to fade. The need for constant validation starts to disappear. You stop chasing quick wins, and you start building something that actually lasts. Because now you understand the truth most people never reach. You were never meant to control your mind. You were meant to understand it, to work with it, to guide it through repetition, through environment, through deliberate action. Not by forcing it into submission, but by shaping the conditions that influence it over time. And once you accept that, the entire struggle changes. You stop fighting every thought that enters your head. You stop reacting to every emotion that rises within you. You stop expecting yourself to feel perfect before you act. Instead, you focus on what you can actually control. Your actions, your environment, your consistency. You begin to trust the process you are building, even when your mind feels chaotic. You begin to rely on systems instead of motivation, on structure instead of emotion, on repetition instead of intensity. And slowly, your mind starts to follow. Not because you forced it, but because you trained it. This is where the real shift happens. You no longer see yourself as someone who is constantly battling their own thoughts. You become someone who understands that thoughts are temporary, but actions are defining. That feelings will come and go, but behavior is what shapes identity. And that understanding gives you something powerful, stability. You are no longer thrown off by every bad day. You are no longer broken by every moment of doubt. You are no longer dependent on feeling good to move forward, because you have built something deeper than that. You have built consistency that exists even when your mind is not cooperating. You have built discipline that does not collapse under emotional pressure. You have built a way of operating that continues, regardless of how you feel in the moment. And this is what separates those who stay stuck from those who move forward. Not talent, not intelligence, not even motivation, but the ability to act without needing perfect internal conditions. The ability to move forward without controlling every thought. The ability to stay consistent, even when your mind tries to pull you back. And when you reach this point, you realize something that changes everything. You were never weak, you were never broken, you were never lacking discipline. You were simply using the wrong approach, trying to control something that doesn't respond to control. But now you see it clearly. Now you understand how your mind actually works. And that means you are no longer trapped by it. You are no longer reacting blindly. You are no longer losing the same battles over and over again, because now you are playing the right game. And when you play the right game, with the right understanding, with the right strategy, something inevitable begins to happen. You start to win, not all at once, not in one dramatic moment, but steadily, consistently, powerfully, and this time it lasts, and as that steady progress begins to take root in your life, something even deeper starts to emerge, a quiet confidence. Not the loud kind that seeks validation, not the temporary kind that comes from motivation, but a grounded certainty built from experience. Because now you've seen it for yourself. You felt what happens when you act without waiting for perfect emotion. You've seen what consistency can build, even in small steps. You've experienced how your mind starts to change when you stop fighting it and start shaping it instead. And with that experience comes a powerful realization. You are no longer dependent on your mind to lead you. You are learning how to lead it. This is not control in the traditional sense. It is not about dominance or suppression. It is about direction. About awareness. About choosing your response instead of being ruled by impulse. And that changes everything. Because most people live at the mercy of their internal world. They react to every thought. They obey every emotion. They believe every doubt that appears. And without realizing it, they become passengers in their own life, carried wherever their mind happens to go. But you are stepping out of that pattern. You are no longer reacting automatically. You are no longer letting every internal signal decide your direction. You are creating space between stimulus and response. And in that space, you are finding something most people never access. Choice, real choice. Not the illusion of choice that comes after the mind has already decided, but the conscious ability to pause, observe, and decide differently. And at first, this feels small. Almost insignificant. But over time, these small moments of awareness accumulate. They stack. They build. They reshape the entire structure of how you operate. Because every time you choose differently, you are not just changing an action. You are changing a pattern. And every pattern you change weakens the old version of you and strengthens the new one. This is why transformation feels slow at first, because you are not just learning new behavior. You are dismantling old conditioning that has been running for years. But now you understand something most people never reach. The goal is not to eliminate your thoughts. The goal is not to stop your emotions. The goal is not to silence your mind. The goal is to stop obeying it blindly. And once that shift happens, everything becomes more manageable. Not because life gets easier, but because you stop making it harder by reacting to everything internally. You begin to see thoughts as events, not commands. You begin to feel emotions without being controlled by them. You begin to move forward even when your mind resists, because you are no longer negotiating with it. You are guiding it. And that guidance, repeated over time, creates something powerful. A version of you that is not easily shaken. A version of you that does not collapse under internal pressure. A version of you that continues forward even when resistance shows up. Not because the mind is silent, but because you are no longer listening to everything it says. And in that silence, in that distance, in that space you've created, you finally realize something profound. You were never meant to be controlled by your mind. You were meant to rise above automatic reactions and finally live from conscious direction.